What most people misunderstand about empaths is that their sensitivity is not a weakness they need to fix. It is a weapon the world desperately needs. We live in a civilization that rewards numbness. That celebrates people who can shut off, move fast, and feel nothing. And somewhere along the way, the ones who feel everything were told they were broken. But here is the truth nobody is saying out loud. The empath does not feel too much. The world around them simply feels too little. You were not born hypersensitive by accident. You were built with a nervous system wired to detect what others miss, pain hiding behind a smile, fear disguised as anger, loneliness dressed up as confidence. You walk into a room and you already know what the silence is carrying. That is not a disorder, that is a gift. And more than a gift, it is a calling. Because throughout human history, in every tribe, every community, every broken system, it was never the loudest person who held things together. It was the one who could feel the fracture before it became a collapse. That person was an empath. And if you are watching this, that person is you. You were not chosen for an easy life. You were chosen for a necessary one. Think about the first time you realized you were different. Maybe you were sitting in a room full of people who were laughing, and you were the only one who noticed that someone in the corner was not really okay. Maybe you were a child watching your parents argue, and instead of feeling scared, you felt their pain so deeply that you started trying to fix it before anyone asked you to. Maybe you cried at things other people shrugged off. Maybe you walked away from conversations carrying weight that was never yours to begin with, and nobody explained it to you. Nobody sat you down and said, "You are built differently." Your nervous system picks up signals that most people never receive. Nobody told you that what you were experiencing had a name or a reason or a purpose. So you did what any person would do when the world gives them no explanation. You made one up yourself. And the explanation most empaths arrive at, after years of feeling too much in a world that feels too little, is this: something must be wrong with me. That is where it starts. That quiet internal conclusion, the belief that your sensitivity is a malfunction, that your tears are weakness, that your awareness of other people's emotions is a burden nobody else has to carry because nobody else was careless enough to be born this way. And the world does not rush to correct that belief. In fact, it reinforces it at every turn. You were told to toughen up. You were told you were too sensitive. You were told to stop taking things so personally, as if the feelings you were picking up were even yours in the first place. The classroom rewarded the kids who were loud and unaffected. The workplace promoted the people who could make hard decisions without losing sleep. The culture you grew up in handed trophies to those who could move fast, feel nothing, and keep going. And you watched all of that and thought, I cannot do that. I feel everything. Every decision has weight. Every person has a story I cannot ignore. Every room I walk into tells me something nobody else seems to be hearing. So you tried to shrink it. You tried to turn down the volume on what you were feeling. You practiced being less affected, less available, less open. You watched other people move through life with a kind of emotional efficiency you admired and envied, and you tried to copy it. But here is what happened. Every time you tried to numb it, something in you resisted, because you cannot train out what is structural. You cannot unlearn what is woven into the way your brain processes the world. Empathy at that level is not a habit or a choice. It is architecture. It is the way you were assembled. And the cost of spending years trying to dismantle your own architecture is enormous. It shows up as exhaustion that does not go away with sleep. It shows up as anxiety that has no clear source because the source is not yours. It belongs to the people around you that you have been quietly absorbing. It shows up as identity confusion because when you spend so long feeling everyone else's emotions, you start to lose track of which ones actually belong to you. It shows up as loneliness. And that is perhaps the most painful part, because empaths are almost never alone. They are surrounded by people who love them, who need them, who come to them when things fall apart. But there is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being deeply seen by very few. From living in a world where most conversations stay on the surface, and you are standing at the bottom of the ocean wondering why nobody ever dives. You sit across from people and you see things they have not said. You feel the grief underneath the smile. You sense the tension in a voice that claims to be fine. You know when someone is lying, not because they gave you evidence, but because your body registered the inconsistency before your mind had time to process it. And you cannot always explain how you know, so sometimes you stay quiet about it. You hold the knowing and say nothing because experience has taught you that saying, "I can feel that you are not okay" to someone who has just told you they are fine is not always welcomed. Sometimes it frightens people. Sometimes they pull back from you. Sometimes they call you intense. And so the empath learns to edit themselves, to share only the version of their perception that the room can handle, to carry the rest quietly and alone. That is the cost of the gift when it has not yet been understood as one. Because here is what nobody taught you when you were sitting in that room feeling everything. What you were experiencing was not random. It was not a glitch. You were not malfunctioning. You were functioning at a frequency that most human beings simply do not have access to. And the reason it felt like a disorder is because the environment you were in was not built for people who operate at that level. Put a deep-sea creature on land, and it will struggle. That does not mean the creature is broken. It means the environment is wrong. You were not broken. You were in the wrong environment. Or more precisely, you were in an environment that did not yet know how to value what you were carrying. Because the truth about empaths is this: the world needs you more than it knows how to say. Every community that has ever held together under pressure had someone in it who could feel where the fracture was forming. Every family that survived its hardest moments had someone who noticed the quiet ones, who stayed when everyone else left, who somehow knew what was needed before anyone asked. Every team, every group, every relationship that recovered from something devastating recovered because someone refused to let the pain go unwitnessed. That someone was not the strongest person in the room. They were not the loudest or the most confident or the most certain. They were the most attuned. And attunement at the level empaths carry, it is not soft, it is not passive, it is not sitting in a corner crying about the state of the world, although there is nothing wrong with that either. True empathic attunement is a form of intelligence. It is pattern recognition at the emotional level. It is the ability to read a human being the way a musician reads a room and adjust and respond and create something that shifts the energy entirely. That is power. Real, rare, necessary power. But most empaths never get to that understanding because they are too busy apologizing for existing at that frequency. They are too busy trying to explain why they cannot just let things go, why they need more time to recover after difficult interactions, why they cannot be in certain environments without feeling physically affected. They are busy defending their experience to people who do not share it and will never fully understand it. And the defending drains them, the justifying exhausts them. The constant effort to make their inner world legible to people who have never visited that depth takes energy that was meant for something else entirely. It was meant for the mission. Because there is a mission, and it is not a small one. You were not given this level of perception so you could spend your life managing it quietly in the background of other people's stories. You were not designed to be invisible. You were not wired this way so you could shrink into rooms and absorb pain and say nothing and disappear. You were wired this way so you could eventually, when you stopped apologizing for it, step fully into what that wiring makes possible. So if you are still in the part of the journey where you believe the sensitivity is the problem, I want you to hear this clearly. The sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was that no one around you had the language to tell you it was a solution. You are not too much. You never were. You were simply arriving before the world was ready to receive you. And the world is starting to catch up. There is a kind of work that never makes it onto resume. It does not get a performance review. It does not earn a bonus. It does not show up in any meeting summary or quarterly report. Nobody stands up at the end of the year and gives a speech about it. Nobody even notices when it is happening because the entire nature of the work is that it happens quietly, underneath everything else, holding things together in ways that only become visible when they stop. That is the work empaths do every single day. And most of them do not even realize they are doing it because it does not feel like work to them. It feels like breathing. It feels like just being present in a room and paying attention. It feels natural, instinctive, automatic. So they do not name it as labor. They do not protect their energy around it. They do not clock in and clock out. They are simply always on, always sensing, always quietly adjusting the emotional temperature of whatever environment they walk into. But make no mistake, it is work. It is profound, exhausting, necessary work, and the world depends on it far more than it will ever openly admit. Think about what actually happens when an empath walks into a room where something is wrong. Before a single word is spoken, they have already registered something. A shift in the air, a tension in someone's posture, a laugh that came half a second too fast, or a silence that stretched one beat too long. They notice the person who is smiling with their mouth but not their eyes. They feel the weight of something unspoken sitting in the middle of the conversation, like a stone everyone else is carefully walking around. And then, without being asked, without making an announcement, without asking for credit, they begin to work. They ask the right question at the right moment. They redirect a conversation that was about to turn destructive. They sit next to the person who looked like they needed someone to sit next to them. They hold space for feelings that nobody else in the room was willing to acknowledge. They absorb tension so that others can relax. They translate what someone was trying to say, but could not find the words for. They make people feel seen, not because they were trained to do it, but because seeing people is simply what their nervous system does. None of that shows up anywhere. None of it gets recorded or recognized or rewarded. But remove it from any group and watch what happens. Watch how quickly conversations turn cold. Watch how fast misunderstandings escalate into conflicts when there is nobody present who can feel where the misunderstanding is really coming from. Watch how people who never had to carry emotional awareness start to struggle under the weight of it the moment the empath in the room is gone or depleted or has finally stopped giving. The invisible becomes visible only in its absence, and that is the cruelest thing about the work empaths do. You only truly understand how much it mattered after it stops. There is also a deeper layer to this work that rarely gets discussed. Empaths do not just manage the emotions in a room, they manage the stories people tell about their emotions. When someone is in pain and does not have language for it, they often express that pain sideways. They get irritable, they withdraw, they lash out. They become difficult in ways that frustrate the people around them. And most people respond to that difficulty at face value. They get defensive, they distance themselves. They label the person as toxic or dramatic or too much to deal with. The empath does something different. The empath looks past the behavior and finds the wound underneath it. Not because they are a saint or because they have no limits, but because their perception simply does not allow them to stop at the surface. They see the anger and they automatically feel the fear that is fueling it. They see the withdrawal and they sense the hurt that caused it. They experience other people's emotional states not as information about how that person is behaving, but as information about what that person is carrying. And so they respond differently. They respond to the wound instead of the behavior. And sometimes in doing that, they change the entire trajectory of what could have become a serious rupture in a relationship, a team, a family, or a community. That is not small work. That is the kind of work that holds civilizations together at the seams. But here is what makes it invisible in a particular and painful way. Because the empath handles it before it escalates, nobody ever sees what it would have become. The conflict that never exploded, the relationship that never broke, the person who never completely fell apart, the team that somehow made it through a brutal stretch without losing its humanity. Nobody looks at those outcomes and says, someone worked very hard to make that possible. They just assume things turned out okay because they were always going to. They do not see the empath who stayed up late checking on someone who seemed off. They do not see the quiet conversation that redirected someone who was heading somewhere dark. They do not see the energy it costs to hold space for another person's grief while carrying their own. They do not see the deliberate softening of language, the careful timing, the emotional calibration that went into a moment that looked effortless from the outside. Prevention is always invisible. And empaths are, at their core, emotional preventers. There is also something that happens to empaths in group settings that almost nobody talks about. They become the emotional container for the group. They absorb what the group cannot process. When collective anxiety rises, the empath feels it first and feels it most intensely, often without understanding that what they are experiencing is not entirely their own. When a group is in denial about something painful, the empath carries the weight of that unacknowledged pain while everyone else moves forward unburdened. They become, in the language of psychology, the identified carrier, the one who expresses what the system cannot afford to express directly. And because they are the one expressing it, they are often the one who gets labeled as too emotional, too sensitive, too intense. When in reality, they are simply the most honest person in the room about what is actually happening. That is a profound injustice. Being punished for your accuracy is one of the deepest frustrations an empath can experience. To feel the truth of a situation clearly, to name it or reflect it, and then to be told that you are the problem for feeling it at all, is a specific kind of gaslighting that many empaths have experienced so many times it has become background noise. And yet they keep doing the work because they cannot stop. It is not a decision, it is a function. But here is what the world needs to understand and what empaths themselves need to internalize before they are completely emptied out. Invisible does not mean unimportant. In fact, the most important systems in any living structure are the ones you cannot see. The roots you do not notice until the tree falls, the oxygen you do not think about until it is gone, the emotional connective tissue you do not value until the whole group starts to come apart. The work empaths do is that connective tissue. It is what keeps human beings oriented toward each other instead of away from each other. It is what keeps compassion alive in environments that would otherwise default to efficiency, performance, and self-protection. And while the world has not yet built systems to recognize or reward that work, that does not diminish its reality or its impact. Every person who felt understood in a moment when they expected to be dismissed, an empath did that. Every conversation that ended in connection instead of conflict, an empath steered it there. Every time someone walked away from an interaction feeling a little less alone in the world, an empath made that possible. The work is real, the impact is real, the cost is real. And the empath who finally understands the weight of what they have been carrying, not as a burden but as a contribution, will never again apologize for being the kind of person who feels it all. Because the world is not too emotional because of you. It is still human because of you. There is a version of the empath story that nobody warns you about. It is not the story of someone who feels too much and struggles to fit in. That part most empaths already know. They have lived it, they have made some kind of peace with it. What they are less prepared for is the chapter that comes after. The chapter where the gift, still untrained, still without edges or limits, begins to turn inward and consume the very person carrying it. This is the danger nobody talks about. Not because it is rare, because it is almost universal among empaths who have not yet learned the one skill that transforms sensitivity from a slow burn into a sustainable power. That skill is boundaries, and for most empaths, it is the last thing they learn and the first thing they need. Here is why it takes so long. Empaths do not just feel other people's emotions. They feel the gap between what someone needs and what they are receiving. And that gap is almost unbearable to sit with. When you can feel someone's pain as if it were happening inside your own body, the natural and immediate response is to close that gap, to give, to help, to stay, to absorb, to fix. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like a reflex, like pulling your hand away from a flame. The pain is there, you feel it, and your entire system moves toward relieving it. And for a while, that feels like purpose. It feels like love. It feels like exactly what you were built for. And in some ways it is. But purpose without structure becomes self-destruction. And love without limits becomes a wound that never closes. Because here is what happens when an empath gives without a boundary in place. They give until there's nothing left to give. And then they give a little more because someone still needs something and they can still feel that need even when their own tank is completely empty. They override their own exhaustion. They silence their own pain. They tell themselves that what they are feeling is not as important as what the other person is going through. They minimize their own experience with such consistency and such expertise that eventually they stop being able to locate themselves inside their own life. They become a function instead of a person. The helper, the listener, the one who holds it together, the one you call at 2 in the morning, the one who always shows up. The one who never asks for anything back because asking feels selfish. And selfish is the thing an empath is most afraid of being. So they disappear, not all at once, slowly, quietly. In increments that are easy to miss from the outside and nearly impossible to feel from the inside, because the empath has been so focused outward for so long that inward has stopped feeling like a direction available to them. And the people around them, the ones being helped and held and supported, often do not notice because the empath is still functioning, still showing up, still saying yes. The depletion is invisible because the empath has become so skilled at performing wellness that even they sometimes cannot tell the difference between being okay and simply being practiced at looking okay. This is the burnout that does not look like burnout. It looks like dependability, it looks like generosity, it looks like strength. And from the outside, people see a person who seems to have an endless capacity for giving, and so they keep taking, not out of malice, but because nobody told them there was a limit, and the empath certainly never did. But the limit exists, it always existed, and when it is finally reached, when the empath system finally forces a stop, what follows is not just tiredness, it is collapse. Physical illness that cannot be fully explained, emotional flatness after years of feeling everything, relationships that feel hollow because they were built entirely on the empath output and never on genuine exchange. A deep and disorienting loss of identity, because when your sense of purpose has been entirely organized around other people's needs and you are suddenly too depleted to meet those needs, you are left with a question you have never had to answer before. Who am I when I am not helping someone? That question can be terrifying for an empath because the answer is not immediately clear. They have spent so long being defined by their sensitivity to others that their own interior landscape feels unfamiliar. Their own desires, preferences, needs, and limits have been so consistently placed last that they are difficult to find. And this is where the second danger emerges. Because some empaths, when they reach this point of collapse, do not stop. They do not turn inward and begin the slow work of rebuilding. Instead, they harden. They decide consciously or not that sensitivity was the problem, that feeling was the mistake, that the way to stop being destroyed by the gift is to destroy the gift itself. They close down. They become the opposite of what they were, cold where they were once warm, distant where they were once present. Cynical about connection, about people, about the very things that once made them feel most alive. And the tragedy of that is not just what the empath loses, it is what the world loses. Because a closed empath is not a protected empath, they are a wounded one. And the wound they carry in that closed state is sharper and lonelier than anything they felt when they were still open. Because at least when they were open, there was love moving through them, even when it was costing them too much. There is also a relational pattern that forms inside this danger that is worth naming clearly. Empaths, because of their deep capacity for compassion and their instinct to see the wound beneath the behavior, are extraordinarily vulnerable to relationships that drain rather than restore. They are drawn to people in pain, not because they enjoy suffering, but because pain is something they can feel and respond to, and responding to it feels like connection. But not everyone in pain is capable of reciprocity. Some people in pain are in a cycle that will absorb everything offered to them and produce nothing in return. Not because they are bad people, but because they have not yet done the work to move beyond their own suffering into genuine relationship. The empath stays anyway, because they can feel how much pain the person is in, because leaving feels like abandonment, because they believe, with a loyalty that is both beautiful and dangerous, that if they just give enough, stay long enough, love hard enough, the person will eventually heal and the relationship will finally become what the empath has been pouring themselves into it to be. Sometimes that happens. More often, it does not. And the empath exits those relationships, if they exit them at all, emptier than they have ever been. Wondering how they gave so much and ended up with so little. Wondering if there is something fundamentally wrong with how they love. There is nothing wrong with how they love. There is something missing in how they protect. Because a gift that is given without discernment is not generosity. It is self-abandonment with a generous face. And self-abandonment does not help the person receiving it in the long run, because what they are receiving is not a whole person offering from a place of genuine capacity. They're receiving a person who is slowly erasing themselves in the hope that the erasure will be enough. It's never enough. It cannot be. Because love that comes from depletion carries the energy of depletion. And what people need from empaths is not the last drop. It is the overflow. The gift only works when there is something left inside to give from. When the empath is resourced, rested, boundaried, and rooted in their own identity, what flows from them is extraordinary. It is the kind of presence that genuinely changes people. The kind of care that reaches places nothing else can reach. But that version of the empath can only exist if they are willing to protect themselves with the same ferocity with which they protect everyone else. The boundary is not the wall that keeps the gift from the world. It is the foundation that makes sure the gift survives long enough to matter. There is a moment that most empaths can point to. Not always a dramatic moment, not always a breakdown or a revelation or a single conversation that changed everything. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is so small on the outside that nobody around them even noticed it happening. But on the inside, something shifted. Something that had been positioned one way for a very long time moved. And once it moved, it could not go back. That moment is the awakening. And it is not the beginning of an easy road, but it is the beginning of the real one. Before the awakening, the empath is running on a particular kind of operating system, one that was installed early, reinforced constantly, and never seriously questioned because it seemed to be working. The system is built on one core belief: other people's needs come first. Not as a conscious philosophy, not as a deliberate choice, just as the default, the automatic, the way things are. And inside that system, the empath develops extraordinary skills. They become fluent in the emotional language of everyone around them. They learn to read a room before they have fully walked into it. They develop a kind of relational intelligence that most people never access in an entire lifetime. They become essential, needed, the person everyone turns to. But the system has a flaw built into its foundation. And the flaw is this: there is no variable in the equation for the empath themselves. Their own needs, their own pain, their own exhaustion, their own inner life, none of it was given a category. It was always the remainder. The thing dealt with after everything else was handled, which meant it was almost never dealt with at all. And the awakening begins, for most empaths, not with a sudden burst of self-awareness, but with a slow accumulation of signals that the current system is failing. The signals are different for everyone. For some, it is physical. The body starts producing symptoms that medicine cannot fully explain because the source is not biological. It is the weight of years of unprocessed emotion and chronic self-neglect finally making itself undeniable. For others, it is relational. They look around at the connections they have poured themselves into and realize with a quiet devastation that almost none of them feel mutual, that they have been the giver in every equation and have somehow ended up more isolated than people who never gave anything at all. For some empaths, the signal is anger. And this one surprises them because empaths do not typically identify with anger. Compassion, yes. Sadness, yes. Anxiety, constantly. But anger feels foreign. It feels like a betrayal of who they are. And yet there it is, a deep, slow-burning anger that they cannot talk themselves out of because it is not irrational. It is accurate. It is the psyche's way of finally saying, loudly enough to be heard, what has been happening here is not okay, and you have known it for a long time. That anger, when the empath is willing to sit with it instead of immediately apologizing for it, is one of the most important signals they will ever receive. Because it is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the first honest assessment of the situation that has not been filtered through the empath's instinct to make everyone else comfortable first. And sitting with that clarity, really letting it land without rushing to soften it or explain it away, is often the first genuine act of self-respect the empath has allowed themselves in years. That is where the turning point lives. It does not arrive as a loud declaration, it arrives as a decision. Sometimes a decision so quiet that the empath is not even sure they made it until they notice, days or weeks later, that something is different. They said no to something and did not immediately feel crushing guilt about it. They let someone else carry their own discomfort without reaching in to take it from them. They felt another person's pain without automatically volunteering to fix it. They stayed in their own experience instead of evacuating immediately into someone else's. Small things. But for an empath, those small things are seismic because what is shifting is not just behavior. What is shifting is identity. The empath is beginning, for the first time, to include themselves in their own moral circle, to apply to themselves the same compassion and consideration they have been applying to every other human being in their life. To recognize that their own inner world is not a distraction from their purpose, but an essential part of it. And this is where something unexpected happens. When the empath starts to come home to themselves, when they begin spending real time with their own feelings instead of constantly processing everyone else's, they discover things they did not know were there. Desires that were buried under years of accommodation, perspectives that were suppressed because they seemed inconvenient or too much. A self that is actually quite distinct and quite strong and quite interesting, but that has been running quietly in the background for so long it almost forgot it existed. That rediscovery is not always comfortable. Some of what the empath finds when they finally go inward is grief. Grief for the years spent giving from empty. Grief for the relationships that were never truly reciprocal. Grief for the version of themselves that kept waiting for permission to matter. That grief is real, and it deserves to be felt fully, not rushed through in the name of moving forward. But underneath the grief, there is something else. Something the empath often does not expect to find. There is relief. The relief of no longer having to manage everything, of not being responsible for every emotional outcome in every room they enter, of being allowed to not know what someone else is feeling and simply ask, like a regular person, of experiencing their own sensitivity not as a demand but as a gift they are now choosing how to give, rather than something that is constantly being taken from them without consent. That relief is the sign that the awakening is real, that this is not just a temporary retreat or a burnout recovery that will eventually circle back to the same patterns. Something has actually changed at the level of self-understanding, and that change is the foundation of everything that comes next. There is also a shift that happens in relationships during this turning point, and it is important to name it because it can be disorienting. When the empath starts to change, the people around them feel it, and not everyone responds well. Some relationships were built entirely on the empath's willingness to overgive, and when that willingness starts to come with conditions, with limits, with the expectation of some form of reciprocity, those relationships begin to strain. Some people push back, some express confusion or hurt. Some, without realizing it, attempt to pull the empath back into the old dynamic using guilt or helplessness, or the subtle suggestion that the empath is becoming selfish, cold, or difficult. This is one of the most critical tests of the awakening, because the empath can feel all of that. They feel the discomfort they are causing. They feel the pull of the old patterns, the familiar relief of just going back to the way things were, of making the tension stop by making themselves smaller again. And the temptation to do exactly that is enormous, because for an empath, causing another person discomfort, even discomfort that is healthy and necessary, feels deeply wrong. But staying in the awakening means tolerating that feeling without acting on it. It means understanding that not every discomfort you cause in another person is your responsibility to fix. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold your boundary while someone else learns to adjust to it. That your growth will cost some relationships what they were, and that is not evidence that the growth is wrong. It is evidence that those relationships were contingent on you staying small. The ones that survive the shift, the ones that can tolerate the empath taking up their rightful space, those are the relationships that were real. Those are the people worth building with. And the empath, coming out of the awakening, finally has enough clarity to tell the difference. What the awakening ultimately produces is not a harder empath, not a closed one, not someone who has traded sensitivity for self-protection and called it healing. What it produces is an empath who is finally in their own body, present to their own experience, rooted in their own identity, still deeply feeling, still profoundly aware, still capable of the kind of connection that changes people, but no longer at the cost of themselves. The gift is still there. It was always there. It is just finally in the hands of someone who knows what it is worth. Everything that has been said up to this point has been building toward this. The pain of being wired differently, the invisible work that holds the world together, the danger of carrying a gift without knowing how to protect it, the awakening that finally brings the empath home to themselves. All of it, every hard chapter of the empath story has been preparation, not punishment, not bad luck, not evidence of a life gone wrong. Preparation. Because there is something the empath was always moving toward, even in the years when it felt like they were only moving through difficulty. There is a reason the sensitivity exists at this level, a reason the perception runs this deep, a reason the empath was built to feel what others miss, carry what others cannot hold, and see what others have trained themselves to look away from. That reason is not suffering. The mission was never to suffer beautifully on behalf of the world and call it purpose. That version of the empath story is the one written before the awakening. And it ends the same way every time, in depletion, in collapse, in a quiet disappearance of everything that made the empath extraordinary in the first place. The real mission begins on the other side of that story. It begins when the empath stops absorbing the world's pain and starts doing something far more powerful with it, transforming it. There is a difference between absorbing and transforming that most people never examine, but it is the most important distinction in an empath's entire journey. Absorbing means taking the pain in and carrying it as your own. Letting it live inside you without processing it, without moving it through, without doing anything with it, except feeling it fully and being changed by it in ways that diminish you. Absorbing is what happens before the awakening. It is empathy without agency, sensitivity without direction. Transforming is something else entirely. Transforming is what happens when the empath takes what they feel, that deep and accurate perception of pain, of need, of fracture, and uses it as information rather than as a weight. They do not just feel the wound, they locate it, they name it, they bring it into the light in a way that allows it to be addressed instead of just endured. They become the bridge between what is happening beneath the surface and what needs to be said out loud for things to actually change. That is a form of leadership the world does not have good language for yet. But it is leadership in the truest sense, not the kind that operates through authority or volume or positional power. The kind that operates through presence, through truth, through the courage to name what everyone else in the room is feeling, but nobody has been willing to say. And this is where the mission becomes clear. Empaths are not here to fix every broken person they encounter. That was always a misunderstanding of the assignment. The mission is not to be endlessly available, infinitely patient, perpetually sacrificial. That is not a mission. That is a martyrdom. And martyrdom, however noble it looks from the outside, produces nothing sustainable. It burns out the person carrying it and leaves the people around them no better equipped to face their own lives than they were before. The real mission is to model something different. To demonstrate, through the way the empath lives and leads and relates and chooses, that there is another way of moving through the world. One that does not require emotional shutdown to function. One that does not treat sensitivity as a liability to be managed. One that understands depth not as a burden but as a dimension most people have never been shown how to access. In a world that increasingly rewards speed, surface, and emotional efficiency, the empath who has done their inner work stands for something radical. They stand for the idea that how something feels matters as much as how it functions, that people are not resources. That connection is not a soft skill, but the central organizing principle of any human system that actually works. That truth told with compassion is not weakness. It is the most powerful force available to any leader, parent, teacher, healer, or human being who genuinely wants to create something that lasts. That is not a small stand. In the current climate, it is a revolutionary one, and the empath does not make that stand through grand gestures or public declarations. They make it in rooms, in conversations, in the daily choices about how to show up and what to prioritize and what to refuse to normalize. They make it by being the person in the meeting who says, I think we need to talk about how this decision is affecting the people involved. They make it by being the parent who teaches their child that feelings are data, not weakness. They make it by being the friend who tells the truth when the comfortable lie would have been so much easier. They make it by refusing to become what the world kept trying to make them: numb, efficient, unnatural. There is something else the empath was built for that sits at the center of the mission and rarely gets named directly. Empaths are here to give people the experience of being truly witnessed, not evaluated, not advised, not fixed, witnessed, seen, felt, received exactly as they are without the experience being immediately redirected toward a solution or a reframe or a lesson. That experience, the experience of being genuinely seen by another human being, is one of the most healing things that exists. Entire fields of psychology are built around the understanding that unwitnessed pain does not disappear, it goes underground. It shapes behavior from beneath the surface in ways that the person carrying it often cannot trace or explain. But pain that has been witnessed, that has been received by another person who did not flinch or minimize or rush to make it more comfortable, that pain begins to move, it begins to integrate. It begins to lose its grip. Empaths do this naturally, is the core of what they carry. And when they do it from a place of genuine resource, from the other side of the awakening, from a self that is boundaried and grounded and no longer disappearing into everyone else's experience, the effect is extraordinary. People leave interactions with empaths feeling less alone in themselves, not because the empath solved anything, but because something in the quality of the attention, the depth of the presence, the clear signal that this person is actually here with me and not just waiting for their turn to speak, does something to the nervous system that changes the internal landscape. That is not therapy. It is not performance. It is just what a grounded empath does when they are in their fullest expression. And the world is starving for it, not metaphorically, measurably. Loneliness is now classified as a public health crisis in multiple countries. Disconnection is rising faster than almost any other social metric being tracked. People are more reachable than at any point in human history and simultaneously more isolated, more connected on the surface and more unseen underneath. More able to broadcast their lives and less able to have their actual experience received by another person who is genuinely present. Into that world, the grounded empath walks. And their presence is not a small thing. It is a necessary thing, a corrective thing, a thing the data is quietly screaming for, even as the culture keeps telling sensitive people to toughen up. The mission of the empath is not separate from the crisis of disconnection. It is the response to it. So if you have spent any part of your life wondering why you were made this way, why you feel so much when the world seems to reward feeling so little, why the sensitivity that cost you so much in certain seasons never fully goes away no matter how hard you try to dial it down, this is the answer. You were not made this way to struggle in silence. You were not built with this depth of perception so you could spend your life managing it quietly and apologizing for it loudly. You were not wired to feel everything just so you could endure everything. You were wired this way because the world needs people who can feel the truth of what is happening and stay present with it long enough to help it change. People who refuse to normalize disconnection. People who know in their bones that how we treat each other matters more than almost anything else. People who can hold space for the full complexity of another human being without needing that complexity to be simpler or quieter or more convenient. That is the mission. It was always the mission. And it was never given to someone who was not capable of carrying it. You were not chosen for this life because it would be easy. You were chosen because you are exactly what this kind of mission requires. And somewhere beneath every hard chapter of your story, you already knew that. The world does not need you to be less. It needs you to finally become all of what you were always meant to be.